Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitinwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
My guest is Dominic Milano. He is a longtime musician, editor, journalist, techno geek, and one of the founding fathers of the trade journalism that used to be very, very relevant in our music industry. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thanks.
I want to sort of rewind first and give people a little bit of background on yourself. You and I arrived in the Bay Area around the same time, apparently, around mid 1970s.
Yeah, exactly.
But you arrived to take the position of editor of keyboard. Is that correct?
Oh, no. I was the assistant editor. I was number 2 guy at keyboard.
Okay.
So in a little bit of background.
Hard.
Yeah, right, exactly. No, 1975, Tom Darter and I, at the beginning of the year, were both at Roosevelt University. He was teaching music composition and various other things, and I was a student. Long story short, he got the call to be the founding editor of Keyboard magazine from Jim Crockett, who was the publisher of Keyboard. And Tom needed an assistant. Jim wanted to hire a guy with all kinds of publishing experience because Tom had little to none. And Tom had other ideas. Tom found out that I could draw. I drew my birthday card that year. And 2 days later, he came to me after class one day and said, "Dom, I didn't know you could draw. Do you know how magazines are produced?" And I said, "Sure." We had this long conversation about Keyboard magazine, the idea of starting Keyboard. And Tom said, "Okay, well, I'm going to go tell Jim about you, and we'll see if we can't get you hired." So 2 days later, Tom comes back with a bunch of questions about paste up, basically magazine production. And of course, when I said yes, I know how magazines are produced, I had absolutely no idea how magazines were produced. But I was in a band with a guy who worked at a print shop. His name was Tom Meisnikowski. He just passed away. Rest his soul.
Knew a guy who knew a guy, basically.
I knew a guy who knew a guy and who had a book.
That's hilarious.
He gave me a book on paste up. I read it that night, went back to school. Tom had gotten a bunch of questions from Jim Crockett, the publisher, about paste up. I knew all the answers. I just read the book. So I said, "Well, that's really cool. Can you write?" I said, "Sure." So he said, "Okay, why don't you write me something this weekend and come back with it, blah, blah." So I wrote him an essay on keyboards, the current state of keyboard playing, and basically said, Keith Emerson was the Jimi Hendrix of keyboards, blah, blah, all that stuff. And Tom had written something similar about a year earlier. So Tom thought, this is a cosmic coincidence. This is meant to be. I have to hire you. And long story short, after some trial and error and some, not error, but just, some trials, I got hired. Tom quit teaching. I dropped out of college. And at the end of the semester, or at the end of the year, we drove out to California and started Keyboard.
So really very, very limited journalistic experience between the two of you.
Yeah, basically none. Yeah. But we had the resources of Guitar Player magazine behind us.
Mm-hmm.
Guitar Player had started in 1968. And by 1975, they wanted a sister publication, basically for keyboard players. And it's not that hard when you're the target audience and you have all the questions in your head that you think everybody that's reading your magazine has too, right? So you just write the magazine for yourself. And that's what we did. But we also had the expertise of the folks at Guitar Player behind us to teach us how to avoid the landmines and all that kind of stuff. And
yeah, they helped you with the nuts and bolts of the whole publishing concept, I guess. Yeah,
exactly. And the interview concept, and where you get photos from, and all, how you get interviews, all that stuff was we had help. Now, to give you some context, there were 9 people in the company, including me and Tom, when we started. So it was a really small, budding field
Right.
that, that we laid a lot of groundwork. We did a lot of stuff that nobody had done before. It was really kind of fun.
Now, what was your background in college? What were you actually studying before you dropped out?
I majored in electronic music composition.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's hone in on that a little bit because as long as I have known you, you have been uh, definitely sort of um, my kindred spirit in being an uber geek.
Yes.
And
Charged. Yeah.
yeah, you've always been really, really fascinated with the tweaky and the twinkly,
Yeah.
and I understand this, that's one of the reasons that we keep running into each other is because of
Right.
that
Right.
love
Right.
of technology. But so in a sense, despite your lack of journalistic prowess, you were really the ideal target audience for your own publication because you were already really into that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I had all the same questions that all the readers did.
Uh-huh.
Um, I wanted to know how to do things. I wanted to know how Keith Emerson got his Hammond to sound like it did. I wanted to know how Wendy Carlos did switched on Bach. And it's just take that ad infinitum for everybody that you'd ever heard of at that point in time, keyboard player wise. I wanted to know how they did what they did. And for me, that, I became fascinated with the synthesizer the first time I heard one, which was probably on an episode of The Monkees.
Really?
Uh, yeah.
Mine was Norwegian Wood.
Yeah, there you go. Well, of course, I heard the Beatles stuff, but I saw my first Moog probably in that one. There was a clip at the end of one of the Monkees episodes. It's
Uh-huh.
famous. It's on YouTube.
I've seen it.
Dolan's owned it, the Moog, and they're playing it, and it's making sounds. And I heard Switched on Bach around the same time, and was just utterly fascinated by what is this thing? So I became obsessed with wanting to know more about Moog, and then Emerson, Lake and Palmer happened. Heard Lucky Man, heard Tank, and really wanted to know. So anytime um, I could get my hands on anything about Moog stuff, I wanted to know more about it. And as it happened, my parents bought me a Hammond when I was in high school, and the guy who did some of my repair work applied for a job at Moog. Um, and I had gotten a brochure out of an ad in the back of Rolling Stone in like 1971 for the Mini Moog and the Moog Sonic 6. And this guy, Greg, um, was a young kid in his 20s. He applied for this gig at Moog. And I lived in Chicago. So it was June. There was a NAMM show in town. And Greg said, "Hey, I've got an interview with Moog. Do you want to come with to this trade show?" I was 16. I was like, "Yeah, sign me up."
Wow.
So I went with Greg to an event in Conrad Hilton. It was a NAMM jam. And Don Lewis and Roger Powell were both performing at this thing.
Oh my God.
Don Lewis was playing an ARP 2500, and I'm sitting there in the audience going, "Oh my God!" Right. Somehow I ended up backstage after the concert, standing next to this 2500, and standing next to me is Dr. Robert Moog. I'm a 16-year-old kid, and my brain's exploding, going, "Oh my God, it's Bob Moog." And I just looked over at him kind of sheepishly. Sorry.
That's easy for you to say. Mm-hmm.
That's right. And said, "Well, what do you think, Dr. Moog?" And he looked at me and he looked at the 2500 and he shrugs his shoulders and goes, "It'll fly." That was the first time I met Bob Moog. So, as luck would have it, I helped the guys, Alan R. Perlman and some other people, roll that 2500 up to a hotel room after the concert to get it out in the backstage area. How that happened, I have no idea. But I ended up in this hotel room with Roger Powell and Don Lewis. Alan R. Perlman, Bob didn't come up, but I'm standing there meeting all these people who were legendary or became legends. 3 years later, we started Keyboard, and at the same Conrad Hilton Hotel, we interviewed Bob Moog. It was the first interview we did for Keyboard. And when I say we, it was me and Tom Darter interviewing Bob together. I wrote the story, but Tom and I did the interview together. And we asked Bob to write a column for us, and he said yes, and that's how I got to know Bob. And the rest is kind of history.
It's funny how so many of these serendipitous situations come up for us, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
But now for you, I mean, 16-year-old kid, obviously these are your rock stars.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, that part of it's funny, but it seems like you really kind of fell into the whole role so serendipitously. How how was it for you in terms of fitting into the role? Did it really feel to you like it was just a natural progression? You just go
Yeah,
in that sense?
yeah. It was one of those things where people would ask me to do stuff, and I wouldn't hesitate. I'd say, yes, I can do that. And then we would just do it. I'd learn on the job. And it
Clearly.
was, literally, and it was a time where you could do that. You could make mistakes, you could do stuff. And
Yes.
um,
It was the Wild
if
West
you
in a sense.
yeah, yeah, nowadays you could never do that. Nowadays you need a master's degree to sling hash at a local restaurant, right?
Mhm.
Um, but for me, you know, it, uh, over time, I got the reputation of being someone who could get things done. And it was just because, it was just a dumb luck and ambition and drive. You put in whatever hours it took. You learned on the job. Tom Darter and Jim Aiken joined the staff. Anybody who's followed Keyboard Magazine, Jim joined the staff about 3 months in, but Jim and I were roommates. And Jim's a brilliant copy editor and managing editor kind of guy. And he taught me how to write. He and Tom taught me how to write. Um, and you get to be a good writer by doing it. And we did it 24/7 for a long time. Um,
There's another thing that you accomplished that I thought was really interesting. I've read, I mean, I was a keyboard magazine reader from early on, although I was more of a guitar player, always have been. But, um, I was, as I say, also enamored with all of the technology in those days and synths in general. And one thing that I notice if I look at your older writing and the progression of it is that you also learned a lot about the art of the interview. And that's something that I think is in certain ways more significant than the writing itself because it's learning how to ask the right questions, learning how to make
yeah.
it into a conversation. What do they call it? The choice architecture, where the answers that you get are directly dependent on the words you choose to ask the question. And you've become
Right.
really, really good at that as you've worked with artists and as you've interviewed artists. And that's a an interesting that's a fine art in itself, isn't it?
Oh, thanks for the compliment first off, but yeah, that is a fine art, and it's something that you learn as you go along. You have to craft it to each individual because people are different. Um, they have different mindsets and they hear things differently. But that's something you just learn by doing. The guy who was really brilliant at it was Bob Dorschuk, if anybody knows keyboard.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, Bob took that to a level that I can only dream of getting to. Um, but again, I was asking my heroes the same questions that all the readers wanted to know. So there wasn't any, black art to it for me. It was just you learned how to you ask open-ended questions, you don't ask closed-ended questions, you don't get an answer that's just yes or no. That's the danger is answering the question in the question. You learn how to avoid doing that. And then over time, you get to the point where you start realizing you know the answer before they give it to you. And you've got to be really careful not to put that into what you're asking. So this sort of these landmines you learn. Again, it's all over time and through experience.
That's a good point, though. It's partly
Yeah,
that, and it's partly that if you anticipate you know the answer, you're already thinking of the next question and you're already kind of tuned out to their answer. And
exactly.
I think one of the things that I've learned in the process of doing interviews also is that you really have to give them time to let the answer unfold.
Yeah, yeah. And I also found that sometimes the most insightful conversations happened after the interview's over.
Doesn't that
Let the tape
suck?
recorder. No, you didn't. No, you just let the tape recorder keep running, and suddenly you relax, guards down, and it's not that we weren't out to get dirt from anybody. That wasn't. We weren't that kind of journalists, right? We were out to have um, an insightful discussion about someone's art and
Yeah.
craft,
Yeah.
and we were all on the same team. Everybody we talked to for was willing to share their experience and their knowledge, and that was wonderful. So it's like being paid to go to school.
Hmm.
Um, and the people you're learning from are the people you're sitting around having conversation with, whether it's, yeah, anyway, it was just an amazing experience. It was a magical time.
It also opened a lot of doors for you in terms of access to developing technology, because of course, there was so much going on in that era. And I mean, I recall pretty early in the founding days of MIDI, you were getting into a lot of these interesting technologies with MIDI. I remember even must have been like early 80s being at a technology event with you. So I think it was in LA, in fact, and had a band playing who had made all their own instruments, Dekuku, I
Oh,
believe.
sure. Yeah, that
Yeah,
was cyber art. Yeah.
yeah.
That was actually 1989 or 90.
Was
Yeah.
it really that late? Okay,
Yeah.
but I mean, there were other ones before this. That one was just kind of memorable to me
Yeah.
because there was so much fascinating technology in the same show. But
Right.
you really had access to a lot of that, and I probably some influence, at least in terms of the journalistic viewpoint that you had. But must have been really must have been really fascinating to be the first on your block to learn about a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, it really was. Is being at that time I was the editor in chief at Keyboard, and it was like being in the eye of the hurricane, and all information flowed to us. It was amazing. You just had this bird's eye view on all these things that were being developed. And CyberArts is an interesting sidetrack for Keyboard, because what had happened was in 1989, Jim Crockett and Bud Eastman, the guys who owned Keyboard, sold the company to another company called Miller Freeman.
That's right.
And and Miller Freeman's business model was magazine, trade show, website, triumvirate thing. And they were big on trade shows. And GPI, the company that published Keyboard and Guitar Player before Miller Freeman, didn't do trade shows. So Miller Freeman, right after they acquired us, came to me and said, Dom, if you were going to do a trade show about keyboards, what would you do? And I thought, sorry, I'm trying to make this short. I originally thought we'd do a show on electronic music, MIDI, that kind of stuff. And I started talking to my friends in the industry, and they all said, no, there's too many trade shows around. We don't want that. Forget it. But this other thing called multimedia was just happening, CD-ROMs and all of that.
Yeah.
And I took that. There was an event called Digicon that happened in Canada in 1984 and 85, or 85 and 86, sorry, that I loved. It was technology in the arts.
Hmm.
And it only ran 2 years. It disappeared. And I thought I would do that trade show if I could do it again. And Miller Freeman said, "That's a great idea. Sure. Here's a budget. Here's a staff. Go do it."
Damn.
And that's all they did. I didn't write up any business plans or anything. They just said, "This is a great idea. Go for it." And I came back with CyberArts. They thought I was nuts. They were like, "Cyber what? What are you talking about?" I said, "Trust me, it's going to be a big thing." They let me play, and that's where the Cuckoo thing, that was Keyboard's 10th or 20th anniversary 15th anniversary concert, something like that. But when I was putting together this event, it was all about interactive technology. So VR in 1989, think about it.
Yeah.
It's like really, it's, military simulation technology was basically it. The first people to sign up for the conference were the CIA and the Navy. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going off track here, but it was a wild time. I'd call people and like the inventor of the Mattel Power Glove, which is where this conversation that just happened on Facebook with Linda Jacobson you were mentioning. Rich Gold had invented the Mattel Power Glove, and I called Rich. I got his number from somebody, and I started to explain who I was, and he knew who I was. He read keyboard. I'm thinking, what?
All right. Uh-huh.
And that happened constantly with this conference. This wasn't a music conference. It was a technology and the arts conference.
Yes, I remember.
And that was another magical time. It was one of the highlights of my career, where I got to meet all these fascinating people from all these different walks, like animation, computer graphics, just all this early interactive technology stuff. It was really, really cool.
Sure. I mean, a lot of that was happening at that point. And really to be fair, it wasn't just in music at all. I mean, yes, it was,
Exactly.
sure,
Yeah.
there was a lot of synthesis going on. And I think at the same time, there was all, digital graphics were beginning to become viable. Personal computers in general were becoming,
Yeah.
much more ubiquitous at that point. And I think that's where all the merging of these technologies was headed to, obviously, in hindsight. But at the time, man, what a wild ride.
Something that a lot of people don't realize is that in right around that same time, mid 70s, keyboard shared a parking lot with this little known computer company called Apple.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jobs and Wozniak's first offices were on the other side of our building, keyboard guitar player. We had a parking lot, that we'd have jam sessions in our warehouse.
So did
Which
you
is
have one of
basically
the first Apple computers then?
And actually, I didn't. Isn't that funny?
Oh,
But anyway, so we lived in that neighborhood, right? My kids went to the same high school that Wozniak's kids went to. And I would go to PTA meetings and be sitting next to Woz. Of course, he had no idea who I was, and I never introduced myself. But still, we were just at ground zero. A lot of people thought we were in LA, but we were in the Bay Area. So we were, Sequential Circuits was 15 minutes from us. EMU was really close by. There were a lot we had Karma, Stanford Karma right there. There was a lot of stuff going on in the Bay Area at that time related to synthesis.
yes.
You know,
Yes, there was.
yeah,
And in fact, one of the things that you were witness to was the whole development of MIDI.
yeah,
Tell
yeah,
me about that a little bit. That was, you mentioned Sequential Circuits, Dave Smith, who
yeah,
was a huge part
yeah.
of that. What was the
So Dave lived literally a mile away from keyboard when we first came out. He found the magazine on a newsstand, and he called one day that we were working on the second issue, and he said, "Hey, can I come by and show you some sequencer I'm making?" It's like, sure. So he brought it over. It was the Model 600 or whatever, and I wrote it up for the second issue of Keyboard spec sheet, the last page of the magazine. And Dave and I became fast friends at that point. So really, really early days of keyboard. And Sequential just kind of grew up around in the same area. So, the Sequentials had a team that played pool, and they play against the keyboard pool team. By pool, I mean, billiards. And there was a local pool hall that we all went to at lunch, and it was totally friendly competition and stuff, but we were just fast friends with those guys. But when MIDI happened, interestingly, the very first use, the NAMM show in January of whatever it was, 83, where they hooked a Prophet 600 up to a Juno 106 or something.
mm-hmm.
I wasn't there. I was in the hospital. So I missed that whole event. But then suddenly I somehow became the guy at keyboard who was writing about MIDI. Although Bob Moog actually wrote the first article on MIDI, and we published it.
Although Bob was initially kind of skeptical, as I understand.
Yeah, a lot of people were. It was interesting. The whole turmoil in MIDI land thing was all about the skepticism, and some people wanted the 5-pin DIN connector to be an XLR. So okay, that's kind of a crazy idea. Um, I thought the most interesting skepticism for MIDI came from Tom Ray. If you know Tom Ray is, who's a historian,
Tom Ray?
marketing. Tom Ray,
I have his
yeah, you have his book.
book right here.
Fabulous. I'm so happy that came out.
Yeah.
So that started as columns for Keyboard Magazine, you know. Anyway, Tom's take on MIDI early on was that it was too early to standardize because once you standardize things, it freezes innovation. I thought that was the most interesting objection to MIDI at the time that people were objecting to it.
I could see that. I mean, it
Yeah,
obviously
yeah,
did not necessarily become the case, although, there's reasons why we finally have 2.0.
yeah. Well,
But
yeah, and I would argue that 1.0 was plenty enough at the time, and obviously it turned a small budding idea into a thriving industry.
yeah, I'd say
Yeah,
it did okay for itself. Yeah.
exactly. And so, ultimately, history proved most of this or all those guys wrong, the naysayers. But having a healthy amount of skepticism at the beginning was a good thing. It forced people to come together and do stuff, like form the MMA. I think that was essential. That the MMA not formed, instruments wouldn't have played well together in the same sandbox. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah, it went through growing pains, but wow, what an impact on an industry.
absolutely. And way beyond music.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
even,
Yeah,
to this day, all the stuff that the MIDI Association is doing, to bring even more people on board and make it more ubiquitous to consumers in that sense, to end users. I mean, I think at this point, even many non-musicians understand what MIDI is, even if they don't necessarily know they're using it.
right. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah,
fascinating.
it really is fascinating how the industry has changed. For you, after Miller Freeman purchased keyboard, that was the beginning of serial acquisitions, shall we say?
Yeah,
There was a
yeah, yeah.
started changing in the publishing industry, I think.
So it's interesting. Miller Freeman acquired us in '89, and over the next 10 years, I thought things were pretty stable. Uh, there are some people who worked at GPI who didn't like what happened with Miller Freeman because, things seem to change and we can't, Miller Freeman is much more of a corporation. But from the inside, Miller Freeman changed more than GPI did. GPI culture infected Miller Freeman, not the other way around.
Well,
And that was to a good thing, a really
yeah,
good thing.
yeah.
Um, and I would say that Miller Freeman years for me, I mean, I became editorial director of the whole music group, and so my career kind of took off. Um, uh, a lot of people complained that later, um, the business side of things kind of took over what it had more impact on editorial than it should have. That didn't happen when I was still there. I left.
Curious about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's whatever, but um, things changed. Advertising suddenly had more effect on editorial than it should have, and that happened way after I left. Um, but when I was there, Miller Freeman was incredibly supportive of um, editorial rules the roost, and there was a separation between editorial and advertising that it was like church and state. You didn't cross that line.
That's
Um,
what I
if you,
that's what I'm looking for here, Dom, because
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, I recently saw, I don't know if you saw this or not, but someone posted a video looking
right.
at the old magazines and talking about how archaic it was and how he'd never seen a bad review, et cetera, et cetera. And,
Absolutely
I,
true. Like
pardon me?
the bad review thing, that's not true. We printed reviews that made products go away. Just be taken
Yeah,
off
I
of.
mean, I wrote for the magazines too. I never wrote for Keyboard, but I know I wrote for EM and a bunch of other magazines. And one of the things that I never was restricted on was that. And in fact, there was always really a sacrosanct delineation between advertising and editorial. And I'm kind of fascinated about the perspective that people have now about magazines, because of course, magazines in essence don't really even exist anymore. The entire the entire industry has sort of turned on its head. But do you really see that that was a factor back then? I mean, because I don't.
So, okay, I was the editorial director for to a whole bunch of very impactful magazines: Guitar Player, Bass Player, Keyboard,
Yeah.
Music and Computers. And I wrote the policy that basically said, this is what you can and can't do. And advertising never had a single thing to do with any of that. It was all about how you research. Um, Early on, we had a policy that was essentially, and it's kind of funny timing to say it this way, but if someone had any relationship with a company outside of let's say you helped design an instrument or you had input in design, you didn't review that instrument, right? It was separation in the way the Supreme Court's supposed to behave.
Yep. Yep.
You recuse yourself. That's, don't have anything to do with that. And that line it was sacrosanct. You just didn't cross it. And I spent a lot of my time smoothing the feathers of advertisers who wanted to pull their advertising as a result of a review. That happened constantly. I would get calls from very powerful presidents of very big, successful companies saying, I understand you got to do what you got to do, but so do we, and we're going to yank our ads and blah blah, all that kind of stuff. And I would hop on an airplane and fly out, and meet with them, and try to convince them we're not the enemy. If we're going to say this, your customers are too. But that never prevented an ad. Sorry, that never prevented a review from being printed.
Thank you for clarifying that, because that was my experience
Yeah.
as, a hired writer in that sense. And I always felt that that was a very, very important point that, I mean, I know that that there were reviews that were pulled because a company said, and just to clarify here, as far as I know, company was always given a chance before any kind of review went live. Have a look at it. If you have any rebuttal, if something that the reviewer is criticizing is due to a lack of understanding or a lack of good documentation or whatever it is, that they had a chance to rebut that and say, yeah, this is not really the case. Or they had a chance to say, oh, wait, let us fix that. And, at that point, we would always put some kind of a note in there that said, company says that they're going to fix this by the time it's available, whatever it was. But there was never really to my
No,
knowledge,
no, exactly.
the advertising didn't.
Yeah, right, right. So it's funny. There were, as you edited these things or as you were writing them, you became aware of if there were certain words that were landmines that during the review process you knew was going to set them off. And there were words like, however, it does
Really?
this, however. Oh my God. It was like setting a bomb off in their offices, right? You get a call and they'd complain about that word. So, okay, let's change however to but. They'd be happy. It would never change the meaning of the review, but you'd have this back and forth and realize that there was just these words. It's like they would read into what the readers were going to take that to mean. Is, oh my God, this is like, and you'd go, well, we're not complaining about it. We're just saying, that it does this, but it might not do that. So,
Oh, that's fun.
yeah. So it was this interesting give and take, but we never soft pedaled. If something, we didn't call spades bloody shovels, but if it was a bloody shovel, we called it a bloody shovel. Um, and part of that conversation that happened on Facebook over that video, which I haven't watched, was some people said, some magazines have the attitude that, well, why review a bad product? There's only so much space in a given issue. Why not just focus on the good stuff? Keyboard didn't take that attitude. My policy was, if a product was getting a ton of advertising support behind it, people wanted to know about it. In other words, there's a lot of buzz.
Sure.
If it sucked, well, tell people it sucked. So much sucked. If it had issues, wanted to tell them what those issues were. I remember when, oh, what was it? Notator? It was like the great, huge, brand new, um, I don't remember the name of the product. Sorry, it was music notation software.
Mm-hmm.
Waiting for it. It was being heralded as the next best thing since sliced bread. And I did a really deep dive into it. And the guys at Passport, one of its competitors, were calling me Saint Dominic because the review is positive, but it pointed out all the stuff that it couldn't do. I showed that you can't take this and very easily do like Bartok style ligatures and stuff. That was a lot of work with it. Whereas if you used a Passport product, you could do that stuff because it was made more for a music notation person.
Uh-huh.
And it was that kind of thing where we dive in and sort of show people, okay, you think this will do everything on the planet? Well, maybe it doesn't. Anyway, so yeah, it was an interesting time to be. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and how did that change? I mean, I know you eventually stepped away.
Yeah.
For personal reasons, I guess.
No, not at all. No, what happened was when CyberArts happened, at the very first CyberArts, this is a funny story. I opened the conference with a keynote speech welcoming everybody and used a gag reel that I built from videotape of a Doctor Who episode with the Cybermen in it. Right? And I didn't ask for permission for that. I just did it.
Oops.
And I no, and as part of my intro, I said, I'm sorry, this is copyright infringement. And if anybody's here from the BBC, I'm really sorry. And after my speech, I'm walking back into the audience. The guy comes up to me, it's Brian Hodgson, head of the BBC Radiophonic Orchestra. He's in the audience. And he's like, saying, "Oh, that was great. Thank you for doing this and all this stuff." And he said, "This is really, you should do a magazine about this." And I said, "We're going to." And in the back of my head, this light bulb's going off. Why didn't I think of that? Oh my God. So that's where Interactivity Magazine came from 4 years later. We launched in 1994, and that became my baby. And that's what I stepped away from keyboard from. I never quit keyboard. I faded away. So I was still editor-in-chief / editorial director at Keyboard. I was editing Interactivity. In fact, I was writing every word in Interactivity for a while. I was the only staff member, me and an art person. And then I think I promoted Tom Darter, who had come back to the magazine after he was the founding editor. He left. He came back. I hired him back. And then I promoted him back to being editor again. So he was technically editor 1. I was editor 2. He was editor 3 of the magazine. Anyway, that's when I faded away. I went and focused on Interactivity. We acquired a magazine called Digital Video. I became the editor of that magazine. Then we acquired Game Developer, and over time, I spent a year being their editorial director, mentoring Jamil Moladina, who was their editor-in-chief. And then focused on DV for a long time. Interactivity got shut down right when the internet happened. Right before the whole internet thing happened, and that was Interactivity's market, and they shut it down right before that. Anyway, that's when I faded away and started focusing on the digital technology magazines.
It's interesting though, because again, you were sort of ahead of your time there in that digital video was such a big part of the internet.
Yeah.
And so what happened to the magazine when the internet hit? Or what happened to your direction when the internet hit?
So it was Interactivity, and DV was one of our competitors, and then we acquired it, and Interactivity went away. I ran DV for a long time. But our focus went away from being just internet centric. It became video production in general. And, DV cameras became the sort of, it was basically high quality consumerized or democratized high quality video production. And we focused on that. And, the magazine did really, really well. The internet hadn't eaten its lunch yet. It took a long time for that to happen. But when we did Cyber, the writing was on the wall. As things digitized and became streaming and all that stuff, other delivery methods that were slow, magazines had 2-month lead times. That could never survive in this day and age. I'm amazed that there are any magazines still being published. Obviously, things like, I don't even know what the magazines are called anymore, but things from the interior design industry, they're picture books.
Well, and that's what's left of most publishing at this point. Anything that's on paper is pretty much token.
Yeah, right. Or it doesn't, like I said, it just doesn't need that immediacy. And it's like, go grab a book for inspiration.
Yeah. I like books. They're nice and tactile and everything, but I think we've all realized, the entire world, that the immediacy that's afforded to us now, you're not going to get that toothpaste back in the tube.
Right. Well, and then the idea that you can take your phone, stick it on a little tripod, and shoot a video of you reviewing an instrument. How do you beat that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And for me, that you're talking about interviewing techniques and stuff like that. When you do an interview in person and it's not on video, it's just on tape, and you're not going to play the tape for anybody, you can stumble over your words and not spit your question out correctly and still get a great answer. And when you read it in print, all that's gone because you can clean it up. You're not printing the ums and ahs and, oh, that's not what I meant to ask. Let me ask you it differently. You read it, it reads as if it was a smooth, television interview. And I don't have that skill.
Although now, as a digital video expert, as well as I do, you can clean up a hell of a lot, especially if you do a multi-camera shoot.
Oh, of course. Yeah. That's very, very true. It's just that what I'm saying is that the idea of doing a podcast or a live interview show like this, that's not something I would have felt comfortable doing. So why I didn't end up doing that after I left the magazine world. I'm a tech writer. So
that's interesting. I do see what you're saying, but I'm surprised only in that you spent so many years being pretty much, front and center as a local figure in that sense, and you seem to be fairly comfortable with talking to people in public and everything. So,
that I am. Yeah, and I'm fine with speaking in public, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Although funny, my very first public speech was at a San Francisco computer fair, and the talk was about MIDI. I was completely unprepared. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never done it before. And the guy sitting very front row, right in front of me, was Bill Gates. It was an utter, complete train wreck.
I had a similar experience. My very first Tech Tracks panel, I'm interviewing a stage full of multi-Grammy winning producers on the art of production. Not the technical aspects, but the artistic. And as I get done with my introductions and I'm about to ask my first question, Frank Filippetti stops me and says, "Wait, I just want to acknowledge here right in the front row, Mr. Ken Scott."
Oh my gosh.
No pressure.
Yeah.
But it's in a way that trial by fire is really what makes us, isn't it?
Yeah.
So where did you go after digital video? I know you had your fingers in so many different things for the last 20 years or so.
So DV was the last magazine I worked on. It was in 2007 that I got laid off. It was one of those with the music magazines and DV were published by the same group at that point. Things had been moved around and we all got stuck together again. Whereas the magazines I was working on for a long time, we got put in different offices and I was completely removed from the music mags. Then we got joined at the hip and they sold that division off. When they did that, the new CEO came in and went through the offices interviewing people and stuff. And I was the longest tenured employee at that point. It's 34 years.
Wow.
He spent 30 seconds talking to me, literally came in, introduced himself and left. And I thought to myself, he's looked at the spreadsheets. He's thought to himself, who is that guy? Why does he make that much money? What the heck? So I thought for sure I was going to get laid off. It took him at least 2 years before they did that. So when I got the call, I came in, it was a Wednesday morning, got the call, it was my boss, he was in New York. I could hear him, his voice was quivering and he was nervous. Okay. And he told me, he said, you know, I'm gonna blah, blah, blah. They offered me my job, but I would have to take a pay cut that would set my salary back literally 20 years.
Whoa.
And I would be reporting to somebody else. And I was just like, no, thanks. But my first words were, what took you so long? I knew what was coming. Right? So I left. That was, and I told him, you know, let me stay for a couple of days. I'll do a handoff to the new guy. And, you know, just, they wanted to escort me out of the building right then. Why? And, you know, I'm not going to try to break anything. I've worked here for 30 years. Why would I try to hurt something I've spent my life building? So anyway, my last day at work was my mom's birthday, April 13th, 2007. It was Friday the 13th.
Ooh.
I went home, thought to myself, there was an NAB was coming up on Monday. So I had tickets to go. So
That's the fun show anyway. Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, so I went to Kinko's, printed up some business cards that had my name, my phone number, my cell number, and my email address on them. And I just went to that trade show. First booth I went to is Adobe. I told the guys at Adobe I'd just been let go. And they said, that's great news, Dom. Here's what you should do. Take as much time off as you can stand and then decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Good advice.
Really great advice. So I thought to myself, 6 weeks is about as much time as I could stand being laid off when we're not having a job. So I gave myself 6 weeks off. 3 weeks into that 6 weeks, I got an email from a friend. I was CC'd on an email at IDG Publishing. They wanted somebody to do a newsletter for the gaming industry. I said, I could do that. And the email was basically recommending me for the gig. So suddenly I had a job doing something for IDG, this game-related newsletter for a while. And I just never looked back. Eventually I became a freelance tech writer. Up Adobe as a client, Intel as a client. And it was just this sort of string of word of mouth, AAA clients. So I ended up meeting the company that I work for now. I met him at the local coffee shop. Guy sat down next to me. Hey, I'm Jerome. Who are you? What do you do? And we're introducing ourselves. He just left Adobe, and I just picked him up as a client. So he said, oh, we should talk sometime. I might have some work for you. I said, okay. That was in 2008. Fast forward to 2014, I see him again at the coffee shop. You still doing that thing you were doing for Adobe? Yeah. He said, we should talk. I said, okay, when? I said, now. So we walked down the street and had an interview at their offices are literally 4 doors down from the coffee shop that I used to hang out at. 2 hours later, I had a job as a contractor. 3 years into that, my boss called me into a conference room and said, you know, your contract is up in April. We're not going to renew. Crap. I said, but we're going to offer you a full-time job. Crap. So I took the job, and that's what I'm still doing. I love a great bunch of people. And like I said, I still get paid to go to school for a living.
Isn't that the best part of this industry, though? I feel
It's
like I'm constantly learning stuff, you know? Yeah, it's really wonderful. And you've made so many really, really great contributions through your work. And I will speak for myself in saying, it's been a real pleasure knowing you as a friend and as a colleague and working with you and everything, as well as just looking at your body of work. Dude,
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thanks.
and you're still at it.
Yeah.
The best part.
Yeah, indeed.
Very, very cool. Dominic
Thank-
Milano, thank you for being my guest.
Thanks, Daniel. My pleasure. Take care.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.